Dylan's runs the computer for me every week. Hey, Dylan. Everyone says hello. If you hear me breathing in the mic, I'm sorry. Try to get this going. All right, well, good morning. I'm glad to have everybody here. We don't have a very large crowd, but we got the important crowd, right? Which is everybody. Mark joined us. I wasn't expecting him to be here today. I was expecting you to be like at least half a foot in the grave or something at this point. Yeah. Well, it looks bad now. With the picture you sent yesterday, if no one's already seen and talked to it, Mark got hurt. And I say got hurt, Mark hurt himself after being told by his employees it's not a safe action to take, and he did it anyways. Yeah. Is Mark the reason why your accident board gets reset every week?
Actually, he's exempt. That's why he does.
He's exempt. That's why it keeps. Yeah. Okay. Okay. That makes sense. So OSHA is concerned about the employees. The boss doesn't count. Got it. Okay. Okay. So that's why you do the dangerous, stupid things. No? I'm not going to lie. I give you a hard time on stuff like that. I do the same thing. I'd be stubborn and be like, oh, I'm going to do it. I can do it. I'm still a man. And I'd end up in the same scenario you are. Yeah. Well, it's good to have you. I'm glad you didn't die, because that would have put me permanently every single week, and that just wouldn't have been fun. All right? Well, we are continuing kind of where Mark left off. So last week, he pretty much finished up the Sermon on the Mount, right? So we had just finished Matthew 7. Sermon on the Mount covers, Matthew 5 through 7. And there was a lot to cover, right? I'm going to do a pop quiz for you and have you guys give me all the bullet points. You ready? No. Jesus. He was on the mount. Yeah. I'm sorry, Stephanie, do I need to come down a little bit? Or I just need to learn how to breathe? Because I can hear myself breathing through, and that irritates me. Is that good? No, I can still hear myself breathing. It's because I just found out that the little foam thing's missing, and I couldn't find a replacement for it. So I apologize. You're gonna have to bear with me. You don't? I can hear myself breathe through the speaker. So. With how I talk? Okay. I'm glad you're back. Thank you for coming today. It's good to have you. You came on a great day, right? I haven't talked in like 6 months now? Probably? I think it's been about 6 months. Whenever you guys last went out of town. Yeah, Christmas. Oh yeah, so right around 6 months. Anyways, I'll get on topic. Stop talking like a maniac. We're going to continue. We're going to move on to Matthew 8. But unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to say it, Matthew 8 is literally a continuation from the Sermon on the Mount. We have Jesus just finishing on the Sermon on the Mount, and he goes down, and then he starts doing some things, and some things happen. So I figured it'd kind of be good to rehash really quick and do a synopsis of everything that Jesus covered on the Sermon on the Mount. Not an entire summary and in-depth study, but just really quick bullet points of, all the topical things and all the focus he did, so that we have the context as we move into Matthew 8, because Matthew 8 and what Jesus is doing immediately following the Sermon on the Mount, well, you'll see. It's pretty much a fulfillment of everything he's talking about, if you pay attention, right? I say pay attention, that's his disciples. If they were paying attention, they would see everything he just talked about and him putting it into action. All right, so that being said, Sermon on the Mount, some main things. The big one everyone usually remembers is the Beatitudes, right? These are the, blessed are those who are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek, right? And so you have this list of blessings of, I guess, righteousness or good behavior, good behavior is not a good way to say it. You have Jesus attaching blessings to those who are acting in a righteous way. And he really gives you this list of what righteousness looks like. So when you look at it, you're seeing this is what righteousness is, right? So Jesus is giving you the criteria almost of righteousness and why there's blessings that come from that, right? So it's giving you kind of an idea in the Beatitudes of like a character of people that God looks at and blesses, right? Then we move on to how he talks about how his people are to be the salt and light of the earth, right? You're to be examples, is what the purpose of that is, that you're this shining city on a hill that the world will be able to see as a righteous people or example of how to live in the world, right? Then he goes and talks to, or says exactly that he came to fulfill the law and not abolish the law, right? So he sits there and says, well, he literally says that. I don't know how I'm going to expand on that. He says, I've come to fulfill the law and not abolish the law, which is significant because this is him making a claim as himself as, basically being the Messiah, right? Like, that's what I've come to fulfill. And then we have him raising the bar of righteousness, which is a really big one. And what I mean by that is, he says, you've heard thou shalt not murder, right? So he's referencing the 10 Commandments. And then he says, but I say, you shouldn't have anger of the heart, right? Like, you shouldn't be angry against a brother. And then he says, you've heard thou shalt not commit adultery. And I say, if a man even thinks and looks at another woman with lust, he's committed adultery, right? And then you have him talk about oaths, where he says, basically you want to have complete truthfulness and not just take an oath and swear by things. You want to sit there and let your yeses be yeses and your noes be noes. It talks about, you've heard you're supposed to love your neighbor. I want you to love your enemy, right? So he's expanding that bar. And then we want to summarize that. He's taking and focusing and narrowing down from outward expressions and like how you would look outwardly, like just by not murdering and adultery that people see, to inward expressions, right? So he's moving this goalpost, I would say, of righteousness to an inward expression, right? Where it's the insides matter. That sounds all right. Where what's going on in the heart is what matters and he's focusing on, right? It's not just also like the outside actions you don't do or don't take, right? And then we really see in Matthew 5:20 where he says, for I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And basically setting it to, that's it. I lost my train of thought all of a sudden because the rain distracted me. Huh? Breathe. Yeah, you're right. I didn't breathe. I lost all the oxygen and lost my train of thought. Huh? Yeah, about the Pharisees, right? That unless your righteousness, there it is. Thank you. Unless your righteousness surpasses the Pharisees, right? The whole point of everything he's been saying now and expanding that bar of righteousness is to show us that we can't meet that mark on our own, right? That's the whole reason for him bringing that up and showing it, is that, hey, this is what righteousness looks like. These are all the things righteousness looks like, and get you thinking on how could I even do that? You can't. All right, it brings you into the realization that we can't meet that mark of righteousness. Because who were the most righteous people? The Pharisees, and even then, they know they're not accomplishing that every single way of the, right? And then he goes from that into how to pray, right? We have the Lord's Prayer, how to avoid acting like a hypocrite. So we hear talk about prayer and fasting, how the Pharisees or some people would go out and pray out loud on the street, or if they were fasting, they'd be out on the street and, be like, oh, I'm just so sick, or, I just don't feel good because I'm fasting, right? Like they have this outward expression where that's all their purpose of, where he's saying, hey, don't be like the hypocrites, because the hypocrites are doing it for attention and they've had their reward. He instead says, hey, don't give to be seen, don't do public prayer for praises, don't fast for the appearance sake, so don't make it like hide that you're fasting, keep it hidden so that it's between you and God, right? So that, it's not the purpose of, oh, I'm fasting, look at me, I'm doing the right thing. It's more of, hey, I'm fasting, this is between me and my God, this is my purpose, right? Which is good because you force reliance on him. And it's more focused on an inward devotion, right, rather than spirituality or religious practice. Then he talks about focusing on true treasures in heaven, that we need to keep our eyes and hearts on the heavenly things over the earthly things. Then we talk about not worrying, to put our trust in the Lord. Then he goes and says, About judging others, that's a big one. And one of the key things to take away from that is to analyze yourself before you even consider saying something about a brother or sister or addressing something with a brother and sister, right? So it's like, hey, that same measure you would use is going to be used against you. So make sure that you're analyzing yourself and measuring yourself against that to make sure that you're living righteous, right? Because that's fair, right? If you come up to someone as a brother and sister, this is brother and sisters, by the way, in Christianity and the fellowship of the church. This wouldn't be me walking up to someone that's, on a college campus saying, hey, you're a sinner, you're going to hell because you're having sex all the time, right? This would be me coming to, honestly, one of y'all here that have been coming for a long time. I know your heart's on the Lord. I know I can call you a brother and sister in Christ. And I'd sit there and say, like, I'm not going to point at anyone and say anything because I don't know anything about anyone, right? That's in a sin. But it would be like, say there's some sin and be like, hey, you're doing this and you can't be doing that. And they would come back and say, well, you're doing this, right? Like if I'm not in a spot to, how are you in a spot? You're a hypocrite, right? It's going back to hypocrisy. Does that make sense? Kind of, sort of, yeah? Okay, cool. For what? Yeah, it's literally what he says. Take the splinter out of your own eye, right? Because how can you help a brother or sister or address something with a brother and sister if you yourself have that splinter or sin in your life, right? You can't. You have no ground to stand on, right? Ask, seek, and knock. Literally what it is, Jesus is saying, if you ask of the Father, if you seek the Father, and if you knock at the door, like he'll answer, right? That's a promise. Warning against false prophets. You'll recognize them by their fruit or lack thereof, right? So if you need to analyze someone and determine is that a false prophet, look at the fruit. Like, what are they producing? Are they producing righteous people after God's heart? Or are they not producing anything? Or are they producing people that are liars and sinners and, hypocrites? Same thing with false disciples. Only those who do the will of his Father will enter the kingdom of heaven. So if people are all talk and then they don't actually do anything that Jesus has commanded or God has commanded, then you're looking at what you would say is a false disciple, right? You have someone saying one thing and doing another, which again is now we're seeing hypocrisy is a big topic, right? And then finally, putting into action and practice the words of Jesus. So he ends it with, like, hey, those who do my Father's will, those who do what I say are wise, those who take these words and teachings, right? Jesus ends up saying, like, it's wise to take what he's taught and said and put it into practice. In fact, he says that those are his Father's people, right, who take those things and put them into practice. And then says, and places it, like his words as the foundation, right? So we now go back and analyze everything, and we see that everything Jesus has been talking about on the Sermon on the Mount is a foundation for righteousness and his kingdom to come in the kingdom he's building. Right? And it's wise for us to implement all that into our lives. And so we see Jesus speaking as one of authority through all of this. And that's kind of now getting into what we're going into with Matthew 8. So we've had Jesus talking. It literally ends in Matthew 7, which is the end of the Sermon on the Mount, of the people recognize him as one speaking of authority rather than one speaking like a scribe would say. Right? So as he was teaching them, you start seeing instances of like, not everyone who says to me, right, will enter the kingdom, like, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. I will declare to them, everyone who hears these words of mine. So throughout all of the Sermon on the Mount, he's using language as the incarnate God, as the Savior, right? He's not sitting there saying, oh, it'd be wise to do this, or it'd be wise to do that, or these are people after God's heart. He's talking about his people and the people that follow him. And he's using language of authority, right? Like he has this authority to proclaim these things. And the people recognize this. The final thing I wanted to make with the Sermon on the Mount is the overall theme is Jesus is revealing to us, the people as well that he's talking to, what the holiness of God looks like, what the true depth of sin is, right? Because we're seeing the contrast of murder to anger in the heart, adultery to lust in the heart, right? Like how engraved sin is and how deep it can be. the insufficiency of external religion or practices of that, right? Which we see with the hypocrisy. Our inability to attain righteousness independently. That's just kind of the over-encompassing thing. Like, you can't meet that mark, right, as we already talked about. I don't see how anyone could do that without the help of Christ. And then if you really read into it, right, the necessity of grace and redemption. So once you recognize that you can't meet that, you recognize the need for a Savior, right? And that's the Sermon on the Mount. We see that Jesus and God are really concerned about matters of your heart, right? They're not just worried about your actions, they're worried about where your heart is, right? And where do they want their heart, or your heart, after them, right? And that's the Sermon on the Mount. Any questions? Feel kind of good synopsis, good summary, confusing? Did we get that when we did the Sermon on the Mount? No? Yes? Well, now I got to switch gears, talk about something different. Did we do it justice, Mark? 5 through 7, Sermon on the Mount? Covered it a little bit? All right. Huh? Good overview, yeah. All right, Matthew 8. Let's see real quick. We'll be fine. All right, so we're going to continue from the Sermon on the Mount now. So Jesus comes down the mountain. I just finished teaching everybody, and there's some things that happen. So we're going to quickly read through Matthew 8. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." He replied, "You have little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." When he arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. "What do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs." He said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off, went into the town, and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. There's a lot to cover, a lot to go on. I'm going to do the spoilers first, and the spoiler being what we're seeing between 7 and 8. In 7, we see Jesus teaching with divine authority, right? So the whole entire time he's teaching of authority. He immediately comes down from the mount, as we see, and the first thing he does is he heals a leper, right? Then he heals a bunch of other people. Then he has people trying to follow him, and he tells them the cost of following him. And then we have the demon-possessed men, right? And him casting out demons. So now we're seeing the divine authority in practice, right? We're seeing a demonstration of that authority. So he just preached out of authority, and people may go, he speaks with authority. Where does this come from? To now a demonstration of that authority, so that people can only say, oh, well, that comes from God. Because the first thing he does is he heals a leper. And that's what we're gonna talk about really quick. The healing of the leper, though it's only a few short verses, has so much to unpack from it, it could be a study of its own. The main thing comes from the law that Moses commanded. So the leper comes up to Jesus, and he comes with it, and what he asks Jesus is basically broken down to two things, right? He asks Jesus if he's willing to heal him or cleanse him, and if Jesus would heal and cleanse him, right? So there was no question about if Jesus could do it. The leper came before him asking him if he's willing to do it, which I think, as we see kind of talking with healings, is something that we may struggle now in our time in our lives, or in the modern church with healings, right? And praying for healings. And I think something that always comes up to us is we can sympathize where the leper's coming from. Like, Lord, I know you can heal me if you're willing to do it. And what was Jesus' response? I'm willing, right? And I'm willing, let it be done. And he cleanses them, right? And he cleanses them in a specific way. He actually puts his hand on the leper. For those that don't know the culture around leprosy in these ancient times, I mean, even now probably, lepers were outcasts. If you had leprosy, it was considered not outpouring, that's not the right word, an outward showing of iniquity or sin, right? So the lepers were considered to have some sin in their life, that God's allowed this to come upon them, that they need to be cleansed of that sin, right? That was how it was seen. And they were to be pushed out, and they were cast out or exiled to where they wouldn't be around anyone, right? And, I mean, that carried on for leprosy for a long, long time, right? Even till now, like, I think where leprosy is apparent, like, they're still kind of outcast, even though we have ways to kind of treat certain things of leprosy. But that being said, you weren't going to touch a leopard. That's unheard of. If you touched a leopard, a leopard was considered ceremoniously unclean, right? Like, that was just an unclean thing, because remember, it was an outward expression of sin. It was they had iniquity. So if someone were to touch them, they would be considered unclean. And Jesus heals this man by touching him, right? And he cleanses him. And then when he cleanses him, he tells him to go do something. He tells him, be quiet about the healing, go to the priest, and present the offerings and sacrifices that Moses commanded. And I just want to cover that really quick. And if that's all we end up covering today, good, because it's a really good story. Leviticus. So the offering Moses commanded is covered in Leviticus 14, 1 through 11. I'm going to read it really quick and then make a point of what's happening here. So Leviticus 14. The Lord said to Moses, these are the regulations for any diseased person at the time of their ceremonial cleansing when they are brought to the priest. The priest is to go outside the camp and examine them. If they have been healed of their defiling skin disease, the priest shall order that 2 live clean birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought to the person to be cleansed. Then the priest shall order that one of the birds be killed over fresh water in a clay pot. He is then to take the live bird and dip it, together with cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop, into the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. 7 times he shall sprinkle the one to be cleansed of the defiling disease, and then pronounce them clean. and at that he is to release the live bird in the open fields. The person to be cleansed must wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe with water. Then they will be ceremonially clean. After this they may come into the camp, but they must stay outside their tent for 7 days. On the 7th day they must shave off their hair, they must shave their head, their beard, their eyebrows, and the rest of their hair. They must wash their clothes and bathe themselves with water, and they will be clean. On the 8th day they must bring 2 male lambs and 1 ewe lamb, a year old, each without defect, along with 3/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering and 1 log of oil. The priest who pronounces them clean shall present both the one to be cleansed and their offerings before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of the meeting. I will stop there. You can leave 11 up, Dylan. What we're seeing in the significance of what Jesus told the leper is to go and, what did he say? He said, go and make the offering Moses commanded. So if we see in the first part of 1 through 11, it talks about how to be ceremoniously cleaned. And then we get to here in 11 where it says, the priest who pronounces them clean shall present both the one to be cleansed and their offerings before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of the meeting. What did Jesus do to the leper? He cleansed him. So 1 through 11 has been covered by Jesus, and he's telling the leper to go carry out this last part. The significance here is the very first act Jesus does coming down from the Sermon on the Mount is that of a high priest or a priesthood. So he's now cleansed a man and said, hey, go do as Moses commanded and bring the offerings. What's even more interesting, there's actually 2 offerings involved that cover in the rest of this. I just didn't want to have to read all of Leviticus 14 again with y'all. The second aspect of it is a sin offering and atonement that the priest is to make for that person on their behalf with them. Well, what happens with Christ later on? He dies on the cross and becomes a perfect sin offering and atonement, which meets and fulfills everything required in Leviticus. So not only do we have Christ acting as a high priest or priest right away in our first story with the leper, we also have him carrying out and fulfilling the commands and laws in Leviticus from the very first action after talking about the kingdom of heaven and what righteousness looks like. Like I said, there's a lot we could still break down and still cover, but that's the synopsis and I thought really cool aspect of it. The simple thing of that question, well, what is the offering that Moses commanded? I was like, Christ is a high priest. Christ is the priest. This is him doing priestly duties and telling this leper to follow what's commanded in the law. I thought that was cool. Anyways, what an example of Christ's authority, right? He takes that he acts in authority as a priest. All right, now the other healings. Faith of the centurion. That's a good one. That's a lot of people's favorite and like one of my favorites. If any of you watched, I think a lot of you have been watching The Chosen, right? The Chosen's depiction of that is so good. Like I haven't watched all The Chosen. I've seen a lot of clips through YouTube Shorts and all that, and it's just, that's so good, right? And just the example of that faith and recognition of authority from the centurion carries out and shows just where God is and how he's willing to meet us in different aspects or different variations of faith, right? So here we have the centurion coming on behalf of another, and he's asking for healing on another. And we have no idea of what the other person's faith is as far as God's concerned, whether they believe he can heal him, whether they're asking God to heal them. It didn't matter. We had the centurion who believed Christ had the power, had the ability, to the extent of he just had to say it and it would happen. So we're seeing an example of someone's faith for another person in healing, right? And then we have all the demon-possessed, all the other who are sick, all those other people. And it seems like kind of like a mass thing, right? Where we don't get where their faith is. We know they're coming to Jesus. We know that they're coming before him and he's healing them. He's driving out evil spirits. We're just seeing that as an example of fulfilling what was said in Isaiah, right? That he would take their infirmities, he would take their diseases, right? And that we're seeing an example of his authority there. And then we have Peter's mother. And Peter's mother has a fever. It doesn't indicate in any shape or form that it's life-threatening. It doesn't indicate that, she's suffering or that, she's in a really bad state and unhealthy. It just says she has a fever. And it says Jesus healed her. And so in my mind, I'm sitting here like, okay, so that's kind of a minor ailment, right? Like, think about if you had the cold. That's what I'm thinking. Like, you have a cold, you have a little bit of a fever. It's like, I'm uncomfortable. It's not going to kill me. And Jesus is still healing somebody for that. And then we have protection from the storm, where there's clearly a fear versus faith thing going on, right? The disciples have this storm, and we have, them freaking out, we're going to die, and Jesus is asleep, and Jesus is like, you have no faith. What is this? Like, you just saw me do all these things already. You've seen some of the other miracles. You've heard me talk with authority. Like, what are you afraid of? And then he just literally goes and commands nature to stop. And we see an example of his authority over nature. Not just over spiritual things or not just over, man, but his authority over nature to command it to stop. And then the demon-possessed man or men. So interesting. We could go on a side thing I'm sorry, Dylan, you can put that down now. I'm done with Leviticus. You have the demon-possessed man, but here in Matthew, he says 2 demon-possessed men. In Mark and Luke, they say 1 demon-possessed man. Insignificant, right? It could have been 2, could have been 1. The focus was on demon-possessed men or demon-possessed man who Christ drives them all out of into the pigs, right? Think of how, we may all tell different aspects of a story, right? Like, so if me and my friend come up and nothing happens with my friend, I might not mention my friend. I'll focus on the aspect of the story. So if you see that or anyone else brings up, like, oh, what about this contradiction? It's not really a contradiction. It's just 3 different people saying a story with the significance of the events that they saw. With the overthing not changing. There was demon-possessed, there were demons, they got cast out into pigs, and you see an example of Christ's authority over spirits. So we literally see, what's the phrase he uses? A house divided can't stand, right? So, how can Beelzebub drive out demons? Like a house divided can't stand, right? So you can't sit there and say, oh, he can drive out demons by the power of Satan. No. All right. So these all serve in examples, and everything we've seen as the authority of Christ, right? We see the authority over impurities and cleansing, authority over diseases, nature, demons, and his ability to cleanse and restore. And the reason why I wanted to point out some of the faith aspects to it is, as I was looking at it, something that's always been in my mind, or I always end up coming back to thinking and seeing throughout my growth and walk with Christ is faith and healing and how those play a role, right? For context, I think of when I had prayed for my grandmother or my aunt who had cancer, and they passed away. It came to was my faith not strong enough? Was their faith not strong enough? What's happening here, right? Because God says, ask and you shall receive, but the healings weren't received. So what's happening here? And it becomes this internal struggle. And when I go and now reading Matthew 8, I start to see the roles of different levels of faith and where Christ meets them and God meets them. Right? So now let's go to the leopard. The leopards wasn't a question of, can God heal me? It was a question of, will God heal me? So his faith was, God can heal me. I just need him to be willing to do it. And we see God showing that he is willing to heal, right? And then we have what I would say is kind of a surprising faith, right? Like these insignificant things of colds and that, oh, God's not going to want to, this isn't that big deal. It's not going to kill me. God's not going to want to heal that. Well, he did it to Peter's mother, who just had a fever. Just said, it just says, hey, Peter's mother had a fever when he was over, and he healed her, and then she got up and started serving him right away. So he meets them there, right? Unbelief or their lack thereof. So as far as protection is concerned, we had the storm going on. His disciples clearly had no faith that Jesus was there sleeping and they'd be okay, right? They were afraid, and yet God still met them there and protected them and acted out, right? And then we have, this is a big one. This one I don't know how to, well, I kind of do. I'll say that. The demons, like the demon-possessed men, they didn't come and approach Jesus, right? In fact, you could argue that Jesus made sure to pass this route to bring restoration to these people that were possessed, right? So the two demon-possessed men were like in this cave. Nobody went there because they knew that they were there and they would block the way, and you couldn't go that way, right? Because these men were strong, and they knew they were crazy and demon-possessed, so everybody avoided it. And yet Jesus intentfully, is during his journey, goes that way and has this encounter. And what's he do? He casts them out and sends the demons out from these men. But those men weren't looking for freedom. They didn't come to him. They didn't have faith in Jesus. And yet he is coming into a spot and meeting somebody who has no faith to show them who he is, and he uses his authority to free them. All right, so now we see a complete lack or no faith whatsoever, and yet Jesus is still meeting people there. And I think that, and I was saying I didn't know how to like rectify that in my mind, but now I kind of do. It's for his glory, right? It's for God's glory, and to show what Christ has authority over. Does that make sense? I'm not being too crazy or heretical here, am I? No? Okay. All right, so what's the point? I think I'm pretty close on time. I am very close on time. I'm sorry. You all have been wonderfully patient in listening to me. Thank you so much. What's the point? It wasn't clear. The Sermon on the Mount was teaching from a divine authority of Christ, right? Matthew 8 starts as a demonstration of his divine authority, right? As we clearly can see now that he talked about it in an authority, and now we're seeing his demonstration of authority, right? And it actually continues going on as we go into like Matthew 9 and 10. Like we're going to see a continuation of Christ's, you say, proof or demonstration of his authority, right? As the Son of God. Which we get in hindsight. His disciples and the people there were in the process of learning and seeing that, right? And so then we can see Christ is the one who can cleanse the unclean, calm the fearful, restore the broken, command creation, defeat evil, fulfill the law, and act as a true high priest. Does that make sense? Yeah? No? Any questions? Questions are a good one. Did I say anything confusing? Because I know I can just kind of ramble. No? Are we all tired now? Our brains are full? Was it too much? It's too much for you, Steve? I want you all to be honest, by the way. I don't like, and I know I've said this several times, and I'll say it every time I talk, I don't like talking at people. So I really do like when people say things and do things. Yeah. Well, it's good because the purpose is to learn. Like what we want to do is make sure we're learning and understanding, right? I don't see how you can get learning and understanding with me just talking at you. Right? Because you may have a question that like I haven't even thought of or any of us have ever thought of, and we need to be able to at least say, hey, I don't have the answer. Let's go get the answer. Let's go look at the Bible. Let's go pray. Let's figure this out. Does that make sense? All right, cool. All right. We'll go ahead and just close in prayer, unless anyone has any questions. If you do end up having a question and you didn't want to ask, come up to me, you can come up to Mark, you can come up to Roger. I mean, really anybody here. We can all talk about it. All right. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for today. Thank you that we're able to come before you and worship together. Thank you that we're able to come before you and read your word. Thank you that we're able to, really just see who you are, what you taught and why you taught, and what you came to do. It was really cool to see your fulfillment of the law almost immediately after the Sermon on the Mount. And it's just, I just ask that you keep revealing those things to us and showing us those things that we might miss just quickly reading over something. Make those significant to us, help us to hold on to what we learn, and help us to learn more and more of you and how to grow closer to you and how to live a righteous life. Thank you so much. I ask you be with us all this week. Watch over us, protect us, help us and comfort us. Give us your Holy Spirit so that we have wisdom and discernment, and help us just to honor you in all we do, Jesus. Amen. All right, that's all I have today. Thanks for joining.